What if I told you that during the height of the Ottoman Empire, Christian nuns faced horrors that were deliberately designed to be worse than a quick death? The stories I'm about to share with you today aren't found in your typical history textbooks. These are the accounts that scholars have pieced together from hidden documents, survivor testimonials, and records that the Ottoman authorities tried to destroy. We're talking about systematic campaigns that targeted some of the most vulnerable people in society, women who had dedicated their lives to God and service. Today we're diving deep into one of history's darkest chapters, exploring what really happened to Christian nuns under Ottoman rule. And I have to warn you, this content is going to be heavy. But understanding these events is crucial because they show us how religious persecution can escalate into something truly horrific. So grab a cup of coffee, settle in, and let's uncover the truth about these forgotten victims of history. Let me start by setting the scene for you. We're talking about the 15th through 17th centuries, when the Ottoman Empire was at its peak power. The Ottomans controlled vast territories across Europe, Asia, and Africa. And while many history books focus on their military conquests and architectural achievements, there's a much darker side to this story. The Ottoman Empire had a complex relationship with Christianity. On paper, Christians were considered dhimmi, protected people who could practice their religion if they paid special taxes. But the reality on the ground was often very different, especially for Christian religious communities. Nuns represented something that particularly threatened Ottoman rulers. These women had rejected marriage and family life to serve God. They often ran schools, hospitals, and charitable organizations. In many ways, they were independent women with significant influence in their communities. And that made them targets. Let me tell you about what happened in Constantinople in 1453, right after the Ottoman conquest. Sultan Mehmed II had just captured the city, and his soldiers were given 3 days to loot and pillage as a reward. The convent of the Holy Sepulchre housed dozens of elderly nuns who had spent decades serving the poor and sick. These women, some in their 70s and 80s, thought they would be safe in their holy sanctuary. They were wrong. Ottoman soldiers broke down the convent doors and dragged the nuns into the streets. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. They didn't just kill these women outright. Instead, they were forced into slavery and sold in the markets. Imagine being a 70-year-old woman who had lived her entire adult life in prayer and service, suddenly being paraded through slave markets like cattle. The psychological torture was intentional. The Ottomans understood that for deeply religious Christian women, this kind of humiliation was worse than death. But the abuse didn't stop there. Many of these elderly nuns were forced to work as servants in Ottoman households. They were made to cook pork, which violated their religious beliefs. They were forced to witness and sometimes participate in Islamic rituals. Their heads were shaved, their religious habits burned, and they were dressed in the clothing of servants. Every aspect of their identity was systematically stripped away. Now let me tell you about the younger nuns, because their fate was even more horrific. Young women who had taken vows of chastity were specifically targeted for the Ottoman harems. The irony was deliberate and cruel. Women who had dedicated their lives to celibacy were forced into sexual slavery. The psychological trauma of this violation cannot be overstated. These weren't just random acts of violence. They were calculated psychological warfare. The Ottomans kept detailed records of these captures, and we know from these documents that there were specific orders to target convents. One particularly disturbing account comes from the siege of Belgrade in 1521. The convent of St. Barbara housed about 40 nuns, ranging in age from 16 to 60. When Ottoman forces took the city, they didn't kill the nuns immediately. Instead, they locked them in their own chapel and set it on fire. But here's the twisted part. They left the doors unlocked. The nuns could have escaped the flames, but only by renouncing their faith and converting to Islam. Most chose to die in the fire rather than abandon their beliefs. The few who did escape were immediately enslaved and faced years of torture and abuse. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern that repeated across the Ottoman Empire. The strategy was clear: make the consequences of remaining Christian so horrible that people would convert out of sheer desperation. Let me share another account from the island of Cyprus in 1571. The monastery of St. Nicholas housed both monks and nuns who had lived together in a religious community for generations. When Ottoman forces arrived, they separated the men from the women. The monks were given a choice: convert to Islam or face immediate execution. Most chose death and were killed quickly. But the nuns faced a different fate. They were kept alive and transported to slave markets across the empire. The youngest and most attractive were sent to harems in Constantinople and Damascus. The older women were sold as domestic servants. But here's what makes this even more cruel. Many of these women were kept deliberately close to their homeland. They could see the mountains of Cyprus from where they were enslaved. They could hear news about their families and former communities. The psychological torture of being so close to home but unable to return was devastating. Some historical accounts describe nuns who went completely mad from this treatment. There are records of women who stopped speaking entirely, others who would only pray in whispers, and some who attempted suicide repeatedly. The Ottomans had learned that physical death was often easier for these deeply religious women to accept than spiritual and psychological destruction. So they chose the path that would cause maximum suffering. Now I want to talk about the children, because this gets even darker. Many convents also served as orphanages and schools. When Ottomans captured these institutions, they didn't just take the nuns, they took the children too. Young girls who had been raised by nuns were often forced into the devshirme system. This was the Ottoman practice of taking Christian children, converting them to Islam, and training them for government service or the military. But the girls taken from convents faced an additional layer of trauma. They had been raised in an environment of religious devotion and purity. Suddenly, they were thrust into a world that violated everything they had been taught to believe. Many of these girls were specifically chosen to become concubines or wives for Ottoman officials. The contrast between their religious upbringing and their forced new lives was intentionally jarring. Some accounts describe girls as young as 12 who had been studying to become nuns themselves, suddenly being married off to Ottoman soldiers. The psychological damage to these children was immense and long-lasting. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all this was how systematic it was. This wasn't random violence or the uncontrolled actions of individual soldiers. These were coordinated campaigns with specific goals. Ottoman records show that there were quotas for how many nuns should be captured from each region. There were detailed instructions about how to break down their religious identity. There were even manuals describing the most effective ways to psychologically torture these women. The goal wasn't just conquest, it was cultural and spiritual annihilation. The Ottomans understood that destroying the religious leadership of Christian communities would make it easier to control and convert the general population. Nuns were particularly valuable targets because they often served as teachers and community leaders. By brutalizing these women, the Ottomans sent a clear message to all Christians under their rule. And the message was simple: your faith cannot protect you, your God will not save you, and resistance will bring suffering worse than death. Some of the most heartbreaking accounts come from letters that surviving nuns managed to smuggle out of the empire. These letters, written on scraps of cloth or carved into pieces of wood, describe unimaginable suffering. One letter, found hidden in the wall of a ruined church, was written by a nun named Sister Maria. She had been captured during the siege of Rhodes and sold into slavery in Anatolia. Her letter describes being forced to watch as other nuns were tortured for refusing to convert. She writes about women who had their fingers broken one by one for continuing to make the sign of the cross. She describes nuns who were branded with Islamic symbols and forced to wear them like badges of shame. But what stands out most in her letter is not the physical abuse, it's the psychological warfare. She writes about being forced to listen to Islamic prayers 5 times a day, about being made to prepare food that violated her religious dietary rules, about being told repeatedly that her Christian God had abandoned her. The calculated nature of this psychological torture shows just how sophisticated these campaigns of persecution really were. The Ottomans weren't just trying to break these women's bodies, they were trying to break their souls. And sadly, in many cases, they succeeded. There are accounts of nuns who eventually converted to Islam not out of genuine belief, but simply to make the torture stop. These women then faced a different kind of hell, the guilt and shame of feeling like they had betrayed their faith and their sisters. Even when the physical abuse ended, the psychological trauma continued for the rest of their lives. This is why many historians argue that what happened to these Christian nuns was indeed worse than death. Death would have been a release. Instead, they were condemned to live with the destruction of everything they held sacred. Their faith, their identity, their dignity, their community. Everything was systematically destroyed while they were forced to remain alive and witness it. The few nuns who eventually managed to escape and return to Christian territories often never recovered. Many spent the rest of their lives in silence, unable to speak about what they had endured. Others died shortly after their return, seemingly from the psychological trauma rather than any physical ailment. The ones who survived long enough to give testimony left us these accounts that historians have pieced together. But we have to remember that for every nun whose story was recorded, there were dozens or hundreds whose experiences were lost forever. The true scale of this tragedy may never be fully known. What we do know is that these events had lasting impacts on Christian communities throughout the former Ottoman Empire. Many convents simply never recovered. Entire traditions of female religious life disappeared completely from some regions. The fear of what had happened to previous generations of nuns made it difficult to recruit new women to religious life. The stories I've shared with you today are difficult to hear, and they were difficult to research and present. But I believe it's important that we remember these forgotten victims of history. These women died not just physically, but spiritually and psychologically, in ways that were deliberately designed to cause maximum suffering. Their stories remind us that religious persecution can take forms that go far beyond simple execution. Sometimes the cruelest thing you can do to someone is to destroy everything that gives their life meaning while forcing them to keep living. We can't change what happened to these brave women, but we can honor their memory by refusing to forget their stories, and we can use their experiences to better understand how religious persecution works and why it's so important to protect religious freedom for everyone. If this video has opened your eyes to a part of history you didn't know about, please hit that like button and share it with others. These stories need to be told, and the more people who understand this history, the better equipped we'll be to recognize and prevent similar tragedies in our own time. What do you think about these historical accounts? Have you encountered other examples of religious persecution that went beyond simple violence? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this difficult but important topic. And if you want to see more content about hidden histories and forgotten stories, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.